Picture this. You're standing at a crossroads in life. Your career, your relationship, or a choice so powerful it feels like the very ground beneath you is trembling. The weight of uncertainty pins you down, leaving you desperate for a crystal ball that could reveal the road ahead. But what if I told you that crystal ball has always been here, hidden in plain sight, waiting for those willing to open their eyes? What if the true key to shaping your future isn't found in fortune tellers or modern algorithms, but in the timeless wisdom etched into the forgotten pages of history itself? Today, I'm going to reveal how you can become a time traveler of sorts, using the past to navigate your future with shocking accuracy. This isn't some mystical concept or feel-good philosophy. This is applied history, and by the end of this video, you'll have a practical framework that will revolutionize how you make decisions, spot opportunities, and avoid costly mistakes. But first, let me ask you something that might sting a little. How many times this year have you been caught off guard by events that seemed to come out of nowhere? A market crash, a relationship ending, a job loss, or even a global pandemic? Here's the uncomfortable truth. None of these things actually came out of nowhere. They all had historical precedents, patterns that repeated themselves like clockwork. The problem isn't that these events are unpredictable. The problem is that we've forgotten how to read the signs. Most people treat history like a boring collection of dates and dead people. They think it's irrelevant to modern life, something you study in school and then promptly forget. This is perhaps the most expensive mistake you can make. While everyone else is stumbling blindly into the future, you're about to learn how to walk with your eyes wide open. Let me start with a story that will change how you think about patterns. In 1847, a Hungarian doctor named Ignác Semmelweis noticed something disturbing. Women giving birth in one wing of his hospital were dying at 5 times the rate of those in another wing. The difference? One wing was staffed by doctors who also performed autopsies, while the other was run by midwives who didn't. Semmelweis realized that doctors were carrying death from the morgue to the maternity ward on their unwashed hands. When he instituted mandatory hand washing, death rates plummeted immediately. But here's the kicker. The medical establishment rejected his findings. They ridiculed him, ostracized him, and eventually drove him to a mental breakdown. It took decades for his ideas to be accepted, long after countless preventable deaths. Now, fast forward to 2020. As the world grappled with a new pandemic, those who understood this historical pattern saw what was coming. They recognized the signs of institutional resistance to new ideas, the tension between established authority and emerging science, and the human tendency to reject uncomfortable truths. They prepared accordingly, while others were caught completely off guard. This is applied history in action. It's not about memorizing dates or dwelling on the past. It's about recognizing that human nature doesn't change, and that patterns repeat themselves across different contexts and time periods. When you understand these patterns, you gain an almost supernatural ability to predict and prepare for future events. Think about your own industry right now. Are there signs of disruption that others are dismissing? New technologies that established players are ignoring? Changing consumer behaviors that industry leaders are slow to acknowledge? History suggests that the next major disruption is probably already visible to those who know how to look. But let's get practical. How exactly do you apply historical thinking to your everyday life? The first step is learning to recognize what I call historical archetypes. These are recurring characters and situations that appear throughout human history in different forms. Take the archetype of the disruptor. Throughout history, we see individuals who challenge established systems and face fierce resistance before ultimately changing the world. Galileo challenging the Church's view of astronomy. Ford revolutionizing transportation, while being dismissed by experts who insisted cars were a fad. Jobs returning to Apple when everyone thought the company was finished. Each of these stories follows a predictable pattern. The disruptor identifies a fundamental flaw in the existing system. They propose a radically different solution. The establishment fights back viciously. There's a period of struggle and uncertainty. Finally, the new paradigm emerges victorious, and everyone pretends they saw it coming all along. When you recognize this archetype, you can spot disruption opportunities early. You can identify which established industries are vulnerable, which new ideas have genuine potential, and when to bet against conventional wisdom. More importantly, if you're the disruptor yourself, you can prepare for the inevitable resistance and stay strong through the difficult middle phase. Another powerful archetype is the bubble cycle. Human beings have been creating and destroying economic bubbles for centuries, yet each generation thinks their bubble is different. The Dutch tulip mania of the 1600s, the South Sea bubble of the 1700s, the stock market crash of 1929, the dot-com boom and bust, the housing crisis of 2008. Every bubble follows the same psychological stages. Initial innovation creates genuine value. Early adopters make spectacular returns. Media attention draws in mainstream investors. Prices become disconnected from reality. Warning signs are dismissed or rationalized. The bubble pops spectacularly. Everyone claims they saw it coming. Right now, can you identify any bubbles forming in your world? Cryptocurrency? Social media stocks? Real estate in your city? Certain college degrees or career paths? By understanding the bubble archetype, you can ride the wave up while preparing for the inevitable crash. But applied history goes beyond just spotting patterns. It's also about understanding the deep psychological and social forces that drive human behavior. One of the most powerful concepts is what historians call the Strauss-Howe generational cycle. This theory suggests that history moves in predictable 80 to 100-year cycles, with each cycle containing 4 distinct phases. The first phase is the high, a period of strong institutions and collective confidence. Think of America in the 1950s, when institutions were trusted and society moved together toward common goals. The second phase is the awakening, when those institutions are questioned and individual rights take precedence. This was the cultural revolution of the 1960s and 70s. The third phase is the unraveling, characterized by institutional weakness and cultural fragmentation. We saw this in the 80s and 90s, with declining trust in government, rising inequality, and increasing polarization. The fourth phase is the crisis, when institutional failure forces society to rebuild from the ground up. The Great Depression and World War II represented the last crisis period. According to this theory, we're currently in or approaching another crisis phase. The old institutions are failing, trust is at historic lows, and society is increasingly divided. But here's the fascinating part. If the pattern holds, this crisis will eventually force a rebuilding that creates stronger institutions and renewed social cohesion. Understanding where we are in this cycle can help you make better personal and professional decisions. During crisis phases, traditional career paths become unreliable, but entrepreneurial opportunities multiply. Old business models collapse, but new ones emerge from the chaos. Social movements that seemed impossible suddenly become inevitable. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works. In the early 1930s, during the last crisis, a young man named Sam Walton was growing up in rural Arkansas. Instead of pursuing traditional careers in law or medicine, he recognized that the crisis was creating new opportunities in retail. While established department stores focused on wealthy urban customers, Walton saw the potential in serving rural and small-town markets that others ignored. By the time the crisis ended and the next high phase began, Walmart had become positioned to ride the wave of suburbanization and mass consumerism. Walton didn't just get lucky. He understood that crisis phases destroy old hierarchies and create opportunities for those willing to think differently. This brings us to another crucial concept: the importance of timing in applied history. It's not enough to recognize patterns. You need to understand where you are in the pattern cycle. Every historical pattern has an optimal entry and exit point. Get in too early, and you might be right, but broke. Get in too late, and you miss most of the opportunity. Consider the pattern of technological adoption. Every transformative technology follows a similar curve. It starts with inventors and early adopters who understand the potential but face significant technical and market challenges. Then comes the early majority, who adopt the technology once the basic problems are solved. The late majority follows when the technology becomes mainstream and essential. Finally, laggards adopt only when they have no choice. The biggest opportunities exist in the transition between early adopters and early majority. This is when the technology is proven but not yet mainstream, when competitors are scarce but market demand is beginning to accelerate. Think about Amazon in the early 2000s, Google in the mid-2000s, or Tesla in the early 2010s. But timing isn't just about technology. It applies to career moves, investments, relationships, and life decisions. Understanding historical cycles can help you recognize when industries are about to consolidate or fragment, when social movements are gaining or losing momentum, when economic policies are likely to change direction. Now, let's talk about how you can start applying these concepts immediately. The first tool in your applied history toolkit is pattern recognition. Start by studying the history of your field or industry. Look for recurring themes, cycles, and archetypes. Who were the disruptors? What patterns preceded major changes? How did successful people position themselves during transition periods? Don't limit yourself to your immediate field. Some of the most valuable insights come from studying analogous situations in completely different contexts. The rise and fall of newspaper publishing might teach you about what's happening in traditional retail. The history of labour movements might illuminate current debates about gig economy workers. Military strategy from ancient Rome might apply to your competitive business environment. The second tool is scenario planning, based on historical precedents. Instead of trying to predict the future precisely, create multiple scenarios based on different historical patterns. What would happen if your industry follows the railroad pattern of rapid growth, followed by consolidation? What if it follows the telephone pattern of steady evolution and expansion? What if it follows the telegraph pattern of technological obsolescence? For each scenario, consider how you would need to position yourself differently. This isn't about betting everything on one outcome, but about maintaining flexibility and preparing for multiple possibilities. History teaches us that the future is uncertain, but it's not random. By understanding the range of historical possibilities, you can prepare for the most likely outcomes while staying alert for unexpected developments. The third tool is what I call historical stress testing. Before making any major decision, ask yourself, has anyone faced a similar situation in history? How did it turn out? What were the hidden risks that people didn't see at the time? What would someone from a different era think about this decision? This process can save you from costly mistakes by revealing blind spots you wouldn't otherwise see. Modern thinking often assumes that current conditions are permanent, or that this time is different. Historical thinking reminds you that change is constant, and that many things that seem solid and permanent are actually fragile and temporary. Let me share a personal example of how this works. A few years ago, I was considering a job offer from a rapidly growing tech startup. The salary was good, the stock options looked promising, and everyone was excited about the company's potential. But when I applied historical thinking, I recognized several warning signs. The company's growth strategy resembled patterns I'd seen in previous bubble periods. The founders had no experience in economic downturns. The business model depended on continuous access to cheap capital. The competitive advantages seemed easily replicable. Most telling, everyone was so focused on growth that no one was seriously considering what would happen if conditions changed. I decided to pass on the offer. 6 months later, when venture capital became scarce and competition intensified, the company laid off 60% of its staff, and the stock options became worthless. My historical analysis hadn't predicted the exact outcome, but it had identified the key vulnerabilities that made a negative outcome likely. This brings up an important point about applied history. You're not trying to predict the future with perfect accuracy. You're trying to improve your odds by understanding the underlying forces and patterns that shape events. Sometimes you'll be wrong, but over time, this approach will give you a significant advantage over people who ignore historical patterns. There's also a psychological benefit to thinking historically. When you understand that current challenges and opportunities are part of larger patterns that have played out many times before, you become more resilient and less reactive. You develop what psychologists call emotional regulation, the ability to maintain perspective during both good times and bad. During bull markets, historical thinking keeps you from getting carried away by euphoria. You remember that every boom is followed by a bust, and you prepare accordingly. During recessions, historical thinking reminds you that every downturn is followed by recovery, and you position yourself to benefit from the eventual upturn. This long-term perspective is incredibly valuable in a world that's increasingly focused on short-term thinking. While others are panicking about daily news cycles or getting swept up in momentary trends, you're playing a longer game based on deeper patterns. But here's where most people go wrong with historical thinking. They fall into the trap of historical determinism, assuming that because something happened before, it must happen again in exactly the same way. This is a dangerous oversimplification. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, it rhymes. The key is to focus on underlying patterns rather than surface details. The specific technologies change, but the adoption cycles remain similar. The particular political issues evolve, but the psychological dynamics stay consistent. The individual players are different, but the archetypal roles repeat. This is why studying ancient history can be just as valuable as studying recent events. The Roman Empire's expansion and decline offers insights into modern geopolitics. Ancient trading networks illuminate current globalization trends. Classical military strategies apply to modern business competition. Let me give you a framework for this kind of analysis. When studying any historical pattern, ask yourself 3 questions. First, what were the underlying forces that drove this pattern? Don't focus on the specific circumstances, but on the deeper psychological, economic, or social dynamics. Second, which of these forces are still active today? Human nature doesn't change, but contexts do. Third, how might this pattern manifest differently in our current environment? For example, consider the historical pattern of empire building and collapse. The underlying forces include resource accumulation, military expansion, bureaucratic complexity, and eventual overextension. These forces are still active today, but they manifest through economic rather than military means. Modern empires are built with technology and capital, rather than armies and territory. Understanding this pattern might help you evaluate the long-term prospects of dominant companies, countries, or even cultural movements. Are they showing signs of overextension? Are they becoming too complex to manage efficiently? Are they inspiring resistance that could eventually challenge their dominance? As we near the end of our journey together, let me leave you with the most important insight from applied history. The future isn't predetermined, but it's not random either. It emerges from the interaction between enduring human patterns and changing circumstances. By understanding these patterns, you gain the power to shape your future rather than simply react to it. Start small. Pick one area of your life where you're facing uncertainty or making important decisions. Research the historical patterns relevant to that situation. Look for analogies and precedents. Consider multiple scenarios based on different historical outcomes. Use this analysis to inform your decisions, but don't let it paralyze you. Remember, applied history is a tool, not a crystal ball. It's designed to improve your thinking, not replace it. The goal isn't to predict the future perfectly, but to navigate it more skillfully. With practice, you'll develop an intuitive feel for historical patterns that will serve you throughout your life. The past is prologue, as Shakespeare wrote. Your future is being written by the same forces that shaped history. By learning to read these forces, you transform from a passive victim of circumstance into an active author of your own destiny. The Time Traveler's Guide to the Future has been in your hands all along. Now you know how to use it.